Okay, welcome to the latest edition of the Sky Talks. It's a pleasure to welcome Murad Banaji, who is a senior lecturer in mathematics at Middlesex University in London. Murad specializes in a wide range of topics in mathematics and their application to various physical systems like biology and chemistry. But of late, he's also been analyzing the statistics revolving the toll of the COVID-19 pandemic in India and has reported that in in variety of journals, newspapers, and also communicated them in variety of interviews in mainstream media and news portals. Um, so I'll hand it over to you. If you have questions, if Murad's okay with it, we can have it during the talk and after the talk.
Yes, absolutely.
Please, a general instruction is please keep yourself muted. And if you have any questions, unmute yourself and feel free to ask. Okay, over to you.
Okay, well, thank you for inviting me to talk to you. Um, as the introduction said, I'm not really a COVID specialist or an epidemiologist. I should kind of put that up front. But I've started thinking about COVID very early on in the pandemic, not really out of a kind of sudden academic impulse to switch to thinking about epidemiology, but more because for practical reasons almost, meaning I was actually in Mumbai for most of the actual pandemic. I was looking at Mumbai's data from the very early days. I was trying to understand it. The way that I try to understand such data is usually with some modeling. So I started to write down some models, and then really I kind of got deeper and deeper and deeper into the kind of whole COVID well in that way. And also a lot of the questions seem to be very pressing questions, and they seem to be, they weren't just pressing questions in some intellectual sense, they were pressing questions in a very practical and immediate sense of understanding what was going on in that case in Mumbai, but also more widely in India and across the world when I started to think about these things. Anyway, I'll talk to you about, I'll try to make it in the form of a story as much as I can of what I learned through this process and what I feel the learning will be as time progresses. So I'll share my screen now. I saw a question pop up asking if I'm going to share the screen. So I'm going to share some slides with you. Unfortunately, when I do that on this device, you won't see me anymore, but I'll come back later on for questions, and you're welcome to interrupt me as I go along as well. So, oh, it's telling me only the host can share in this meeting. Is that right?
Sorry about
okay,
that.
That's changed. That's fine. Okay, I hope you can see what I've put up on the screen.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, good. Okay. So I'm going to talk to you about the challenges of mapping India's COVID-19 epidemic. And that's the kind of broad idea. Obviously, I can't really list all those challenges because there are so many, but I'll give you my feelings about them in the form of a story. So the broad question is, can we ever really know what the true scale of the epidemic in India has been? We know now from lots and lots of different sources, lots of different kinds of data, that official figures tend to hide the scale of the catastrophe. And this refers to both case data and to fatality data. But what we don't really know is how many infections have occurred nationwide, how many deaths have occurred nationwide, and how this picture varies across the country. Because we know that it's a very heterogeneous picture. There's a lot of variability across the country in terms of how disease has spread, but there's also a lot of variability in surveillance in terms of how well the picture has been picked up in case and fatality data. So there is a lot of data out there. If you try to scrape data from different dashboards, city, state dashboards, you'll find there's a lot, and some places at least share really detailed information. So transparency is also very variable. The problem is that the data that's out there is from a modeler's point of view or from somebody trying to understand the epidemic, not always the right data. Sometimes it's kind of approximately right, but it's missing some of the detail that you would like. Sometimes it's just the wrong kind of data for one reason or another. And the data that you get can often hide very complicated stories behind it. I'll come back to that. It's kind of a running theme in my talk, really. So that's one theme in the talk is, trying to get at the data that you would really like. And the second theme is how to deal with uncertainties, because a lot of what we find out through data actually comes with high levels of uncertainty. And when people are analyzing this data, they are sometimes choosing either to ignore the uncertainty or perhaps to deal with it, but not necessarily in the right way. And that's the second kind of theme of the talk, which I'll come back to. So I suppose if one were to put a wish list of what would we really like in terms of data on the COVID epidemic to understand this tragedy properly, you would really like to have accurate local data about infection levels, prior infection levels, current infection levels, fatalities. You would like all this data stratified by age, by gender, by socioeconomic status, by housing, probably a number of other kind of stratifications. You would like regular genome sequencing data so you can understand which variants are circulating, how this picture is changing. That's a recent addition, I suppose, to the wish list in the last 6 months or so. And what do we actually have? Well, we have a few scattered pieces of this kind of big jigsaw puzzle. So we've got a lot more missing than available. And why is it that there's so much missing? Well, it's a mixture of factors. I think that there are structural reasons about how data started to be gathered and shared. There are kind of reasons connected with how data is generally dealt with by government and local government, state government, national government. And there are issues of transparency. There are issues connected with the fact that data can be seen as something quite dangerous. Sharing too much data allows your enemies to attack you or criticize you in some way, so share the minimum. At least some of the time, there are those issues as well. So a mixture of reasons which are, in a sense, avoidable and maybe harder to get around for why the data is so limited. And with the limited data, of course, you try to do what you can. But it's very important to recognize at the outset that if you do what you might call naive data analysis, you take the data at face value and you say, what does it say? You can get things very wrong because you're missing a key ingredient of the underlying story. And a lot of my examples are going to revolve around Mumbai. So let me take a little example from Mumbai for this too. So if you were to just have looked at Mumbai's case data as it stood, and you were in the early days, and you were to try to calculate, say, R, the basic reproduction ratio, different people call it different things, but not the basic reproduction ratio, but the effective reproduction rate, how fast the epidemic is growing exponentially. If you were to try to calculate that exponent, you would have calculated some value, whatever it was, 1 point something in those days. But if you were to actually look at the data with the benefit of what we understand now, with the benefit of future data, which came in a bit later, you would quickly realize that, in fact, under the surface of Mumbai's data, there were two epidemics unfolding. One was an epidemic which was unfolding in the slums, and one was an epidemic which was unfolding in non-slum areas. And with a little bit of processing, you can try to actually separate out those two epidemics. And if you separate out those two epidemics, you find they're very, very different. I mean, the one unfolding in the slums had a much higher R value. It was unfolding much faster, doubling time was much quicker. Its magnitude was much, much greater in terms of daily new infections. But because you had highly variable surveillance, because you had much poorer surveillance in the slums, it was also kind of largely hidden in the data. So although the slums were generating perhaps 50% of all cases, this corresponded to something more like 80% of all infections at that point. So you had really two epidemics unfolding, but you couldn't see this with kind of naive looks at the data. And that's just to illustrate this point, I suppose, that when you just look at data without understanding what's going on behind it, you can miss the story. So given all these kind of limitations, what can you do with what you have? Can you do a lot? And my answer would be yes. I mean, you have to be a little bit of a pessimist to start with. You have to say, okay, there's going to be a limited amount we can do, but let's try to build on what we have. In order to do this effectively, you need to have some kind of framework of assumptions. You need to assume, for example, that COVID behaves roughly similarly across all the parts of the world where it has hit. And it's important to be kind of accurate about what we mean by roughly similarly. Maybe I'll come back to that. But that certain fundamental things about the behavior of this virus don't change. Of course, this framework that you work with is going to be evolving because our understanding of the disease is evolving over time. So it's not a fixed framework, but you need to have this framework. And I'm stressing this because I feel that you can also do or attempt to do kind of black box data analysis, which doesn't take into account what we know, our prior knowledge about COVID and about SARS-CoV-2, about the virus itself and about the evolution of its epidemics. And then you can end up with some completely misleading analyses of the data. So, this kind of framework, I suppose if you're a mathematician or if you're a physicist or a mathematically minded person, then this framework that you work with, we might call a model. So you have underlying models. They don't necessarily have to be highly formalized mathematically. They can be different levels of, they can be mathematically kind of posed in different ways, but you have models kind of sitting in the background. And for the purposes of this talk, a model is basically an input-output machine, something which takes some data of some kind and it gives you some kind of conclusions. And of course, the data itself comes with lots of uncertainties. The model itself comes with uncertainties in its parameters, and so necessarily your outputs are going to come with some uncertainties as well. And this kind of business of recognizing uncertainty is really very, very key, I think, to how we proceed to do it. I'm not saying that you always have to take every element of uncertainty into account, but you just have to have a broad philosophical focus that, yes, there's uncertainty in this quantity. I'm going to recognize that. So what is the goal of modeling? Well, I think there are different goals, but I'm going to give you a little example of something which I've just been playing with recently, which hasn't yet gone up on GitHub, but it will do. I will put it up at some point for people if anybody does want to play with it. So I get asked really often for my opinion on why the first wave wound down when it did, why case numbers and official recorded fatalities came down so low in the intervening period before the second wave started. So say by January 2021, why numbers were not everywhere across the country, but in most places quite low. And in some places very, very low. And I tried to explain that with a slightly, what you might call waffly answer, kind of broad answer, which is that, well, this is not a complete surprise. This is something that we would expect given the very heterogeneous nature, the wide variability that you get in India. But I wanted to just kind of create a few small models which would maybe reflect that. So I wrote down a little model. It's a toy model, in other words, a model which is not meant to be of any particular instance, but just a model which is to build intuition, in which you have one town and 100 villages. And the villages are all connected to the town in the sense that there's some flow of people, there's some interaction between people in the town and people in the villages. And the epidemic, as usually happens, starts in the town. Not always, but as often happens, let's say. And the epidemic rages in the town, and at some point when infection levels reach a certain kind of threshold, you have some kind of a lockdown, which doesn't completely cut out, but reduces interaction between the surrounding villages and this town, for example. Okay, so the lockdown reduces town-village contact. So the town epidemic rages. Okay, there might be some restrictions in the town which slow it down a little bit, but I kind of, in this model, I didn't put in a lot of restrictions, just a limited amount of, so the town eventually actually reaches herd immunity. In the early days, what happens in these villages that surround the town? Well, you get some leakage of infection from the town to the villages, to some villages, and you get some village level epidemics occurring. Once you've got lockdown, that leakage becomes less, but you still have some kind of village level spread occurring as well. what happens as the town epidemic winds down? I just did this particular simulation. I said, okay, let's suppose that you kind of relax all restrictions. So everything returns to normal as the town epidemic winds down. This doesn't mean that infection has gone back to zero by any means. Infection is just at a relatively low level when this happens. What do you see? Well, you see obviously more and more leakage now happening into the villages. You get a kind of surge in the village level epidemics taking place, which is the second kind of on the graph on the right, it's the second kind of surge in epidemics. These are stochastic models, so hence the kind of shaky nature of the lines. You get a surge in these village level epidemics. But this is also happening at a time when overall prevalence is continuing to reduce. Okay, so you get actually, this triggers a slight surge in the town as well, but overall prevalence is quite low. You've got limited contact anyway occurring, and because of the kind of nature of COVID, so-called overdispersion, the kind of the fact that an infected individual only actually has a finite and relatively small likelihood of triggering an outbreak if that individual, say, enters into one of these villages. All of these village outbreaks don't actually add up to a huge outbreak on the scale of the town outbreak, even though you've now relaxed all restrictions. And the kind of thing is, at the end of these model simulations, this is a toy model, let me add, at the end of these model simulations, what you find is that prevalence in the villages, so the rural areas, is actually still considerably below what you would assume the herd immunity threshold to be based on the R values that we've put into the model. So the only point of this little modeling exercise was just to say that when you have a complex network structure, it is not surprising for an epidemic to wind down at well below the herd immunity threshold. There's this idea that epidemics either wind down because you have mitigation keeping numbers low, or they wind down because you reach the herd immunity threshold, is a little bit too simple when it comes to epidemics which are evolving, where the structure of interaction between individuals, or in this case between regions, is more complicated. So in these simulations anyway, that's what they tell you.
So I have a question, Murad.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So in the town, was that a homogeneous population where the epidemic subsided because you did reach a herd immunity?
Yes, that's right. For simplicity, in this particular simulation, that's what I did. So I put the town as, so it's not a, I mean, I don't put it as a homogeneous population in the sense that you still have, sorry, it's a homogeneous population, but you still have the usual variability in the way that one individual, the likelihood of one individual infecting others. So you still have over dispersion even occurring in the town, but ultimately once the outbreak takes off, it takes off. Those kind of stochastic effects become a bit irrelevant in the town because you've got a large outbreak anyway. And yes, it winds down because it reaches herd immunity. That's right.
I see.
Yes.
I see. And so in these cases, in the villages, in some villages, outbreaks break out, but in other villages, outbreaks don't break out at all. Is
that's
that
right? Yes, and you can't see that, I'm afraid, on my right-hand side plot. But you know, out of 100 villages in this particular case, maybe about 20 to 30 of them actually have these outbreaks, which is what you can see. I mean, have major outbreaks. Some of them have more minor outbreaks because, again, of stochastic effects, they're relatively small populations, and some of them have no outbreak at all. You know, for the duration.
And so in the ones that do have outbreaks, you do reach a herd immunity threshold, but the average,
in some of them,
average, you haven't reached the herd immunity threshold.
Correct. That's right. That's absolutely right. Okay. And in general, you do reach a herd immunity threshold in the ones which have outbreaks, but because they're quite small populations, you have the stochastic effects become more important. So you might have a kind of mini outbreak which dies down by chance without reaching herd immunity, even in a village as well. So you get, that's why you can see in the second wave, you can see some variation in the heights of these peaks as well. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah.
So that was just meant to be a little example of how you can use modeling, in a sense, to try to build intuition about what might be occurring. Let me come to the kind of more substantive part of my talk, really. So when it comes to mapping the epidemic, understanding what's happening nationwide, one of the key quantities that I've been interested in trying to understand and trying to track is the so-called infection fatality rate. I'm sure most people listening to this are familiar with this concept, but Basically, the IFR is the fraction of infections which result in death. And if you're trying to estimate it, it's a quotient. You need to estimate how many fatalities have occurred as a result of COVID-19, and you need to estimate how many COVID-19 infections have occurred. The trouble is that, of course, when you're trying to estimate IFR, both the numerator and the denominator come with large uncertainty. So you're estimating a quotient where both sides of this quotient have got lots of uncertainty associated with them. And of course, as a consequence, your IFR estimates are also going to have. Moreover, in some cases, you don't even have a ballpark figure for either the numerator or the denominator. I'll kind of go through Mumbai's story and see how over time we gradually got more and more information about IFR in the city until we could reach a point where we could say we could have some credible estimates of IFR in the city. And then I'll say, well, I'll try to give the lessons at each point, the kind of learning process at each point. So Mumbai is, just to set the scene, it's for the purposes of the data shared by the municipal corporation, it's got about 13 million people. It's had about 7 lakh cases. It's had my estimate of over 10 million infections. So that's a high proportion of the city. Some of those are reinfections. In fact, my median estimate is over 11 million at the moment. And some of those are going to be reinfections, especially in the slums. It's had about 15,000 recorded deaths. In 2020 alone, it had around 22,000 excess deaths. So there was the kind of all-cause mortality data that the city released showed that there'd been a kind of bigger surge in mortality than was visible in the recorded deaths in the city. And at the moment, those vaccination figures might be a little outdated now, but about 7.5 lakh people are fully vaccinated, and about 17 lakh at least partially vaccinated, perhaps a little more now, those from about a week ago. So that's the kind of scene. The first lesson, when I started looking at Mumbai's data, there was so little, there wasn't very much kind of to go on. But nevertheless, I still tried to write down models and I tried to put in parameters which roughly reproduced the city's data. And the first lesson I think you learn is that even without having accurate infection or mortality data, you can still run some models. And one of the things you can use these models for is to try to look for data anomalies, look for things which surprise you. That doesn't mean there's something wrong with the data. It could be something in your model which is incorrect. It could be something going on with the data, but it's an anomaly, and you use that as a kind of point to ask questions, to hypothesize, and to learn. And in May, early May, I was tracking the city's epidemic with this stochastic modeling, and I kind of noticed very early on, in fact, I started to notice this by the end of April, that my predictions for how many fatalities you ought to be seeing, which had been tracking what you did see in the city quite well until about the middle of April, started to go wrong. So the green line on this graph is my predictions. The red line is what was actually being measured. There was a kind of divergence occurring. And I speculated in a piece that I wrote for The Wire at that point about the different possible reasons. One could be that disease was spreading in a younger or healthier population, and so fatalities were going down. One could be that you were missing a lot of deaths because they were not making it onto the official dashboard. As it turned out, actually, the answer was that both were occurring. Both of these things were occurring. We know that deaths were being missed, were not being correctly put into the official figures, because later on in June, there was a major reconciliation and about 1,700 deaths were added back in the space of 2 weeks into the city's count. And I don't know the full story behind that reconciliation, but it's clear that it's at least part of the explanation for why you had this divergence between what you expected in terms of fatalities and what you were observing in terms of fatalities. But there was also another part of the story, which is that it is true, as we learned from later Sarah survey data, that disease was spreading in the slums. The slums have got a much younger age profile than housing societies in the city. So you likely have a genuine reduction in IFR, so fatality rate in the slums as well. And that might partly have explained this divergence as well. So there were two effects going on. At the time, all I could do was really speculate and say that there's an important effect. And if this is about undercounting, then it needs to be taken into account, it needs to be dealt with. And I'm happy to say that at least to some extent it was roughly 1 month later after this piece. In a similar vein, I was also looking at Gujarat. And yeah.
Hi. Yeah, sorry to interrupt you.
No,
There's a
not at all.
question in the
Please
chat
go.
box.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a question in the chat box by Shuman Dotto who says,
yeah,
who asked, like, how much was the reinfection fraction that was considered for Mumbai, and what is the estimated numbers only due to reinfection?
So that's a very difficult question. Maybe I can come back to it at the end, because making that estimate based on available data is very, very difficult. But I'll come back and maybe answer that at the end, if you don't mind.
I see. Sure.
Okay. So another example that I looked at in the same kind of vein of, an anomaly or a divergence between expectations and what was measured was Gujarat. And I think one of the things that people don't really know very often about Gujarat, which is always in the spotlight for undercounting deaths and for huge mismatches. I don't know, I'm sure people have read about these huge mismatches between what's going on in terms of obituaries, what's going on now in terms of excess mortality from all-cause mortality data, and then what recorded COVID deaths are saying. There's this huge mismatch, but it wasn't always like that. In the early days, modeling at least said that Gujarat's fatalities were following what you would roughly expect based on the rest of the available data from the state. But by around July to August, so these plots were, and this kind of tweet is from early August, the plots on the right are a bit small to see, but they're telling the same story as I've just mentioned about Mumbai, which is that you start to see a big divergence, kind of more significant in scale, in fact, than in many other places. And moreover, it's growing. It's growing in not just in absolute terms, but it's growing in relative terms. So the mismatch in terms of the fraction of deaths which appear to be missing from Gujarat's official fatality count seems to be growing. Now, at this point, there's not many ways of kind of putting a sanity check on that. All you can say is this is what the simulations are showing. And by early August, the simulations were saying that between about, out of the expected fatalities, you were only seeing about 1/3 of those being recorded, or perhaps even as low as 1/5 of those actually being recorded. So a much smaller fraction of fatalities were being recorded than you would expect. And of course, yes, please go ahead.
Yes, I have a question. This is also true for the previous slide. So when you say, of course, one comparison is between all-cause mortality data and the recorded deaths, but I think I suspect we didn't have that in August 2020. Correct. When you say comparing with simulations, what is the precise simulation that one does, and what is the data one uses for that?
So that's a good question. It's the same kind of thing as I was showing for Mumbai. So you run these stochastic simulations where you put in a whole host of assumptions about, for example, what is the delay between a case being recorded and a fatality occurring, if that ends up, resulting in a fatality. You kind of track infections with a stochastic simulation. And you try to parameterize those models by looking at the early data. So you look at the data which comes from your first month or so, and you try to parameterize the models based on that. And then you continue to track forward and you look for changes. And of course, you can do this. You can update the model at any point and parameterize it again based on the available data, and then again track changes. So all these models are doing, so they're not making an assumption about IFR. I should kind of just stress. They're not saying that we assume infection fatality rate is such or such. What they're actually doing is they're tracking what appear to be changes in infection fatality rate or in changes in expected versus observed fatalities as time goes on. And you can do this, you can put in a whole host of uncertainty about, because these are stochastic simulations, about, say, the delay between cases being found and fatalities occurring, and the delay between infection and fatality occurring. So a whole lot of different delays, for example. You can put in a whole host of different assumptions about fatality rate if you want to as well. But the point is that all of those assumptions in the case of Gujarat was saying that you're getting deaths going missing. The range, the scale was different depending on which assumptions you put in, but you were still seeing the phenomenon very, very clearly in simulations. If that makes any sense.
Yeah, sure. I think I understand, but just one clarification. What I guess you can really track are changes in the case fatality rate, right? Because you didn't have sero surveys either. So you have a certain number of cases and you track changes in the case fatality rate.
Yes, well, it's a little more complicated than that, because it's a delayed case fatality rate, but because these are stochastic simulations, you've got a kind of range of delays. So you're also checking, in a sense, you're tracking the changes in delayed case fatality rate with a range of possible delays, a range of mean values, and then some kind of distribution around those mean values. And after a while, so even taking all those kind of uncertainties into account, it's basically what this is saying, if you wanted to really summarize it, is that at pretty much any delay that you consider, the case fatality rate starts to drop, and it starts to drop very dramatically in Gujarat. And this is because you're also tracking testing through this process. This is not really explained by any change in testing. For example, much better detection of cases could also lead to a drop in case fatality rate, delayed case fatality rate, and this is not being explained by any of these other possible changes.
Okay,
if that makes sense. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have a question.
Please go for it.
Basically, I'm trying to understand the IFR. So in your model, do you also include deaths due to post-COVID conditions, like post-COVID problems that people have, or is that a completely different story?
Well, the model doesn't really, the model doesn't, in a sense, classify the reasons behind a death. The model, in order to write down the model, you need to make an assumption that some fraction of people, again, it's a stochastic model, so that there's a certain likelihood that at a certain point, which is also, comes with uncertainty, an infected person might die. So you have to put that into the model. It doesn't really attempt to unpack the question of what is a COVID death. Okay, so in a sense, a model can't really do that. You can just say this is what, and we are finding with recorded COVID fatalities early on, and this is what we are finding with recorded COVID fatalities later on. Yeah, so that kind of complicated question of what a COVID death is can't be unpacked in the model, so to speak.
Okay. Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
You're welcome. Okay, so the second kind of thing I want to talk about is about seroprevalence data. So then this starts to come in. This starts to trickle in from a variety of different places, and I think that it provides a really valuable few pieces of the puzzle. So it kind of adds to the story in really valuable ways. So what happens in Mumbai is that you have the so-called first serosurvey in the city. It actually wasn't the first serosurvey that took place in the city, but it's the first one where we have the data publicly available. And what did this serosurvey do? Well, actually, it gave us our first kind of estimates of infection. It helped to unpack the slum and non-slum story, which was the thing I mentioned earlier on, the fact that you really had very different epidemics unfolding. It acted as a sanity check on these previous simulations that I showed you, where we've got deaths going missing, and then you've got a reconciliation. And what the simulations were now saying, these stochastic simulations were now saying, was that yes, the reconciliation kind of reduced the missing deaths in the city quite a lot. So we now have data which is more credible in terms of fatalities in the city. You've still got a mismatch. It's on a much smaller scale now. So it's saying there's about a 40% fewer deaths than we would expect based on the simulations. Of course, we still don't know IFR because we still don't really truly know mortality in the city, right? We now have an estimate of infection levels, but we can say that we can now make statements which are conditional statements. So we can say something like, if, like the one presented here, which came out in a piece in The Wire again, says that if IFR in the city was, say, 0.23%, then we have a story where now you've got about 40% of fatalities missing by August, this is. Of course, there was probably several plots in that piece, I can't remember. So if IFR is different values, you have different expectations of how many fatalities are missing. So the next piece of the puzzle that you need really is going to be excess mortality data. That's going to kind of complete the story. But before we come to this, I just want to say a couple of general things about serosurveys. It's really, really valuable data because it's our first kind of glimpse into what infections are doing rather than just what cases, i.e. detected infections, are doing. On the other hand, it's not always simple data to interpret, as we saw in Delhi. So Delhi had 4 serosurveys during 2020 and then a further 5th one in 2021. the 4 2020 serosurveys returned 23%, 29%, 25%, and 25% seroprevalence roughly. And as you can see, that's a very confused story because we expect those seroprevalence values to be going up, but they're not. In fact, they're fluctuating around some mean value of around 25%. All the while, the epidemic is kind of continuing apace in Delhi during the period of time over which these serosurveys were done. So you clearly got some stuff going on. You've got the fact that the serosurveys are missing some older infections that also came out of the data that Delhi itself released with these serosurveys as well. And there were huge uncertainties in the degree to which you could take those seroprevalence figures as a proxy for prior infection in the city. And clearly with time, it was becoming harder and harder to use that data to actually say, okay, this is the level of prior infection in the city. It was becoming less and less reliable. And the surveys were not accompanied, I'm afraid, by good technical documentation in many cases, although eventually a preprint came out about some of them. Anyway, that was just to make the point that serosurvey data is really valuable, but it's not simple and uncomplicated data. It hides its own complexities as well. So as I said, to complete the picture, to get closer to a complete picture, we really need to have all-cause mortality data. Then we can look, at least we can start to speculate about the degree to which recorded COVID fatalities are reflecting actual mortality. So the Indian Express obtained all-cause mortality data for Mumbai up to July, for the period March to July. And I've forgotten the exact number at the time, but by this point, recorded COVID deaths in the city were perhaps at around 6,000, 5,000 or 6,000, and excess deaths in the city appeared to be at around 13,000. There were some issues with the data and with the precise numbers. There wasn't enough data to actually really write this down as a proper, credible excess deaths figure. So there was still some uncertainty, but factoring in that uncertainty, it seemed to now finally allow you to estimate infection fatality rate in the city a little bit more credibly. And it really, I suppose it really fitted very closely with the previous estimates, which is that infection fatality rate at the time I wrote this, which was in September, I think, really seemed to be matching what the earlier estimates have been, the lower end of the earlier estimates, around 0.23, 0.25%. But it also told a very interesting story, which was that infection fatality rate in the city seemed to have been changing over time, very likely because of the way disease spread initially in building societies, then later on in slums, and then later on again in building societies increasingly during the latter part of the year. But I mean, that's a speculative story, but it was an interesting story as well. I wouldn't say that that excess mortality data, I wouldn't say that excess mortality data completed the story because there was still quite a lot of uncertainties. But really now we had the key ingredients that you need for IFR calculations. You had the numerator and you had a potential denominator. And I just want to add that little detail, which is that in these calculations, I wasn't assuming that all of the excess deaths were in fact COVID deaths. So I did simulations and calculations with a range of values. In this particular plot, I think that I've put, I was assuming that about 60% of the excess deaths, which hadn't been counted as COVID, were in fact COVID deaths. So you have to acknowledge the possibility that there might be other kinds of mortality which go up as a consequence of the pandemic, as a consequence of hospitals being overwhelmed and so forth, but which aren't strictly speaking COVID deaths.
Yes, so there are also factors that run the other way, right? I mean, in this case, in the first wave, traffic accident deaths were also competing with COVID deaths at the same level. So if traffic accident deaths reduced due to the lockdown, that would already give you a factor which would, I mean, it would go the other way. It would mean the COVID deaths were larger than what you were seeing.
Correct,
But
absolutely right.
Traffic accident deaths might have, and do we have a way of estimating that from, which traffic accident
Yeah,
deaths might come
yeah, the data is there. So the data is, I mean, well, it's only as reported in the newspapers, but yes, the data, the numbers are there, they've been reported, and I'll come to that in just a moment. So yes, but the key point that you're making, which is that actual COVID mortality could range from anything between recorded COVID mortality up to more than the excess deaths is an important point. Yes, it can be more than the excess deaths because some kinds of mortality go down. especially, like, for example, rail and road accidents went down very significantly in the city. There seemed to be indications that other kinds of mortality also went down in the city, especially in March and April, when there was a lockdown, but COVID mortality hadn't yet started to go up. So, yes. Anyway. So the next kind of lesson is that even with reasonable data that we now had available, you still need to work hard to take uncertainties into account. So the kind of the story, if you like, concludes when in the early part of this year, the city released all-cause mortality data, and you could track back over the previous 5 years and say, okay, so what happened to mortality in the city over the whole course of the year? How does this match up with what we understand happened with COVID? Let's put in all the uncertainties. Let's run some extensive Monte Carlo simulations and see what they tell us about the range of possible values of spread, so infection in the city, and then the range of possible values of infection fatality rate. And in these simulations, I allowed, for example, fatalities to range between the recorded value and actually a little bit more than the excess deaths estimate from the all-cause mortality data. And you kind of finally, you can, I suppose, credibly put confidence intervals on IFR in the city. And those confidence intervals on IFR were still very wide. So the 95% confidence interval on IFR said that it ranged between 0.15% and 0.33%. So it's still a wide range, but at least you have a chance of doing that. You have some hope of saying that I think it's not below 0.15%, and I think it's unlikely to be higher than 0.33% based on this data. And one of the key things is that if you want to know what's coming next in terms of the second wave, it's really important to have all this data available and this understanding which the data has given you available, because then you can actually hope to credibly track what's happening as the epidemic progresses in the city. And I'll just give you a small example. So I was kind of trying to track from quite early on, from around the middle of April, whether you could see any effect of vaccination in terms of reducing mortality in the city. And I think this is really, really difficult when you've got a second wave, which is really large, unfolding. But because of the previous experience and previous data that maybe a lot of it gathered in that preprint that I just referred to on the previous slide, it was possible to say, okay, something is happening in the city which is interesting. The fraction of elderly people in the city's fatalities is going down really quite significantly. This doesn't seem to be explainable by any of the means that we would have tried to explain it last year. It's also coinciding in time with precisely, it's coming a few weeks after you've had quite high vaccine coverage of the elderly, well, single dose vaccine coverage of the elderly in the city. It's also coinciding with what appears to be a drop in the delayed case fatality rate in the city. So these stochastic simulations are saying, okay, fatalities are starting to diverge away from what we expect them to be, going down again. But this time it doesn't appear to be likely to be an undercounting effect, to be growing fatality undercounting. It could in fact be a growing vaccination-related effect. Of course, you couldn't say this for sure. This was not a proper case control study or a cohort study or any of the kinds of studies you would like to do to prove a vaccine effect. It's what you might call an ecological study, which just finds a correlation and it says this is a plausible explanation for it. But it was only possible because of our earlier understanding of what had happened in Mumbai. Okay, I'm kind of nearing the end of what I'm going to say. I'm just, because I focused really intensively on one city, but I want to say, well, what can we do? How can we kind of take this forward? Well, first of all, where did the story end? The story comes to a point where you've got some confidence in your estimates around fatality rate. Moreover, these estimates seem to align quite well with what international data tells us to expect based on the age profile of the city. But of course, there's still quite a lot of uncertainty. Could you do something similar for other parts of the country? Could you do some kind of a map, like, of this process, which involved this process across the country? Well, you can do it for a handful of other cities, probably, which have had, sero surveys, which have had all-cause mortality data released. maybe occasionally you might even be able to do it for a whole state. But largely the data is not there. And in particular, rural data is largely missing. This has always kind of troubled me when you're looking at, COVID, the fact that rural data is so patchy. And I just wanted to see during this wave, a kind of little offshoot of all of this is I started looking at some just press reports of what's happening in villages. So I collected a total of 61 of these over a period of 3 weeks, in the first 3 weeks of May. And all of these were just press reports on rural outbreaks. And because they were from the Hindi press, they kind of cover the Hindi belt largely and kind of northern and central India. And I found that typically, so the median number of fatalities which were reported as a fraction of the village population was about 0.3%, which is just, to me, really shockingly high, that, in these 61 reports, on a median value of 0.31% of villages died in one of these outbreaks. There were quite a few studies in which over 0.5% of residents died. So what's the kind of conclusion from that? There's certainly no evidence that rural mortality should be lower than urban mortality based on that data. Of course, it's just a snapshot, it's based on media reports, but it says that if COVID sweeps through a village, it can cause really high mortality. And there's nothing to suggest that IFR in rural India should be lower than IFR in urban India. Because I've done a few IFR calculations from several cities where there's some kind of mortality data available, like Chennai, for example. It comes out similar to Mumbai, same kind of range. And here you're saying in these kind of rural outbreaks during the second wave, you've got total mortality, which you always expect to be lower than IFR, which is sometimes very, very high. And of course, another thing that comes out from these is that almost none of these deaths were of people who were tested. There was very little testing and there was very little recording of these deaths. So when you've got this hugely variable picture, how can you stitch together a national picture out of it, out of all these bits and pieces of data? The answer is it's very, very hard, but we have to keep trying. And more data is coming through. It seems like almost every day there's a new report which contains some kind of excess mortality data that somebody has got hold of. And I feel that we need to try to stitch all of that together alongside seroprevalence results, come to estimates of IFR across the country, come to estimates of the level of spread across the country in one way or another. So I'm just going to conclude by saying a kind of few generalities. So when you look at the data, especially if you just look at case and recorded death data, these always hide more complicated stories. They may hide stories about uneven spread between slums and non-slum areas, uneven spread between a city and its satellite towns or villages. They may hide stories about uneven detection. So, testing being very, very poor in some parts of the country, or even within one city, highly variable testing between, say, slum and non-slum areas. So that data hides a lot. In fact, sometimes it obscures more than it reveals. And using it naively or dishonestly is perhaps the worst thing that you can do in terms of obfuscating the actual trajectory of the epidemic. If you use it, you have to use it with your eyes open to all of its many flaws and shortcomings. So to understand that kind of data, for example, you need to know about testing strategies. You need to know what death audit committees are doing and what they're doing with regard to comorbidities and reporting COVID deaths. You need to know whether deaths at home are being counted. You need to know about reporting delays. Are kind of city corporations hanging on to data and then releasing it a few weeks later, a bit at a time, so as to avoid spikes in fatalities, and a host of other matters. Really, you have to take those things into account. What we really want, of course, is we want to have good quality seroprevalence data and as much as possible all-cause mortality data to create a map of what the epidemic has done in India across the whole country. Bits and pieces of that will continue to come in, and I think everyone will do their best with it. A key kind of message of my talk is really that you can take uncertainty into account. So all of this kind of stochastic simulation and these Monte Carlo simulations were my attempts to take that into account. And most people who I think are credible modelers do try to take uncertainty into account rather than just producing point estimates of everything that's going on. I think it's bad if you just ignore uncertainty, but if you're a bit honest about it, that's okay. You know, say, okay, we've just taken a point estimate because we don't know how to deal with all these uncertainties. I think the worst thing that you can do is actually appearing to take uncertainty into account. And I'm going to finish with one example, which is that, for example, if you're computing IFR and you take the recorded fatalities as your numerator, but you take the uncertainty in the denominator, i.e. in the infection levels, which comes out of maybe a seroprevalence survey, if you take that uncertainty into account, so you've taken an uncertainty in the denominator into account and got a confidence interval out of it, but you haven't taken uncertainty in the numerator into account, what you've produced is highly misleading. You present an answer with some 95% confidence interval around it, which is actually not a 95% confidence interval at all. It's a highly biased estimate. And I think you shouldn't have done it, as I've said to a few people who do that. And I will stop there. Open up for questions, and I'll share myself instead of my screen.
Okay, feel free to unmute yourself and ask questions.
Let me stop sharing. Okay.
Okay, let me ask a question first then. So I was just wondering about the quality of data, whether there's a correlation between how well states have handled controlling the infection and the quality of data available. Because in your India Forum article, you talk about some kind of complication related to all-cause mortality data in Kerala, which kind of surprised me. So could you talk something about that?
Well, I mean, so all-cause mortality data in Kerala is kind of a confusing thing actually for 2020, because in 2020, the data shows actually a drop in all-cause mortality. Now, it might be a real drop. It might be connected with reporting delays. There are people I know who are trying to find out what lies behind that, because it seems that some municipalities in Kerala may not have yet reported their data to the national portal from which this all-cause mortality data has been taken. So at the moment, it shows something like a 4% drop in all-cause mortality during 2020. And that's just a very kind of hard thing to interpret. So I suppose what it does say is that even all-cause mortality data can be hard to interpret. Obviously, Kerala has seen COVID deaths. It's possible that lockdown or, national lockdown or other kind of mitigating factors which the state government put into practice to deal with the epidemic actually reduced other kinds of mortality more than enough to offset COVID mortality. That's possible. So that's one possibility. It's possible that there are reporting delays which are taking place, which are kind of confusing the picture as well. So even where this data becomes available, you have to ask a few questions about it. I have to ask whether it really reflects mortality in the state, and you would really like it to be more granular. You would like to know, for example, ages of the people who are dying. You want to see if there are changes in the age structure. You want to see if there are changes which are maybe connected with gender as well. So anything which might give you clues about whether this is COVID mortality or other kinds of mortality that we're looking at. Does that answer your question?
Actually, more broadly, like how does a state's performance in controlling COVID correlate with the amount of data it makes available? It's just what I was going to say.
I don't know. I mean, it's certainly true. So I think that the reason that some states make more or less data available is a mixture of their kind of systems, how well kind of formulated those systems are, how well set up they are historically as well, and their kind of political choices about how transparent to be, how much to kind of share with the independent research community. And so poor quality data and high quality data don't have, I mean, it's not a perfect correlation between better quality data and transparency. There is a correlation, I'm sure of it. So, you know, state dashboards which tend to share more data, I think the data is also of higher integrity, and they are probably in many cases trying to do a better job of actually tracking their epidemic. But sometimes I feel that there are also kind of historical factors behind why their data is better. You know, the kind of state has maybe got just better data systems in place already. But those are very subjective feelings of mine, not really a study in any sense.
Thank you.
I had a question.
Yes.
It's related. Abhishek, do you have any follow-up actually, or can I ask the question?
No, go ahead.
Yeah. So the question was related to something you said about the age structure. So one of the interesting pieces of work I saw in the IFR earlier was actually by Surendra Gupta at the IFR. I don't know, maybe it's, yeah. So and he pointed out that if you look at the age, the ratio of IFR by age that Verity et al. Had estimated pretty early in the pandemic, which was then being used in many cases. And you looked at the age structure of COVID reported deaths in India, then that age structure matched pretty well. So, the total, there was an overall factor which was off because, it always looked like IFR, if you just looked at recorded deaths in India, was low. But there was, the ratio of the IFR for one age group and the other age group was pretty close to international estimates.
I thought that failed to be true once you reach the upper age groups, so the kind of most elderly age groups, at least from the few bits and pieces I've seen. Perhaps I'm wrong. I mean, is that right?
Well, I don't remember the paper very well, but my impression was that it did match pretty well for all age groups. Maybe not for the lowest age group, but I can look it up once more on that.
No.
And
so I think
sure.
that's a really important question. So I mean, it's precisely the kind of thing that you need to do. You need to say, okay, let's look at these international age stratified, data sets that we have, and there are a few now around, and say, well, are we at least reproducing the trend in India? Are you seeing the kind of correct fraction of fatalities in different age groups that you would expect, or the expected fraction of fatalities in different age groups? And if you're not, I wouldn't rush to conclude any one thing, because it can mean different things. It can mean, for example, like in Mumbai, there was a period of time, like by around July, August of last year, when the age structure of Mumbai's fatalities was really dramatically different to what you would expect. It was much, much younger. But that was at least partly explicable by the fact that you'd had this huge slum epidemic, and you'd had a relatively smaller building society, a non-slum epidemic. So this epidemic had hit a younger population at very high levels, between 50 and 60% infected. And unsurprisingly, that was reflected in the age structure of fatalities. And then as time wore on, the age structure of fatalities in the city approached very much closer to what you would expect from these international estimates. So yes, when you get a mismatch like that, it's important to ask the question of why, because another possibility would be, could it be that the deaths of the elderly are being more undercounted? This has been observed, I think, in the UK, for example, that it's more likely for an elderly person's death not to be counted as COVID than for a young person's death. Because I suppose if in a way somebody's approaching the end of life, maybe they've got comorbidities, they're quite unwell, they're quite elderly, it's certainly not in the family's interests to make a fuss about getting a COVID test and getting the death recorded officially. So there could be differential undercounting by age group as well, but there could also be differential spread by age group, with the disease having spread less amongst the elderly for one reason or another.
I see. There's just one thing though. So that was about one of the reasons, one of the supporting pieces of evidence. I mean, I guess it's not evidence in the end, but the IFR in India was lower. Was that neighboring countries were also doing well? So in Pakistan or Vietnam or Thailand and so on. And so I know, of course, do you have anything to say about that? Is it the case that even there, it's just simply the deaths have been underreported massively? I mean, that was one of the things that at least I found when people would say this, I found was somewhat persuasive, saying that look, there's something in South. There are these claims, but the evidence is more looking at neighboring countries. So I was wondering if you have something to say about that.
Well, I mean, I don't have specific knowledge of that, but because I believe that a large part of undercounting, so not all of undercounting is deliberate and systematic. A large part of undercounting is kind of, if you like, systemic. It's connected with limited testing. It's connected with what is the health infrastructure in rural areas. It's connected with how are COVID deaths being recorded, are suspected deaths where there was no test being recorded, are deaths at home being recorded. If those systems are very similar, say in Pakistan and Bangladesh to India, then I would expect you would have similar levels of undercounting in those countries as well. I've certainly seen reports of undercounting coming from Pakistan, but those are anecdotal reports where, a large number of people who are saying, yeah, no, that these deaths were not counted. So I don't know whether there are kind of attempts to estimate the scale of that by the Pakistani media. It's quite possible that there are, but my guess would be, my kind of default position would be that if this appears to be true across the region, we should at least first ask whether maybe the problems are the same across the region. Maybe the reasons why you might have undercounting are the same across South Asia and not unique to India. At least some of them are not unique to India.
Thank you.
Could you comment on the degree of undercounting? Fatalities.
Well, that's a very difficult one. So you or somebody mentioned the piece in India Forum where I tried to do that, and this was based on 2020 data. So based on 2020 data, what I said was that if you take, say, the minimum estimates of IFR from, in fact, I said Mumbai, but in fact, you can take this from other cities as well, where you can get it, where you've got some all-cause mortality data, say for Chennai, for example. And you say, okay, the age structure of these cities is similar to the national one. The health infrastructure is better than the national health infrastructure in these cities. So let's suppose that IFR nationally is comparable to what we're seeing in these better resourced cities. Then you would have at least 3 times undercounting of deaths. So you'd have at least 3 times as many deaths as had been recorded to get an IFR of about 0.15, which I consider the minimum kind of credible IFR from the city studies that I've looked at. Even Ahmedabad, by the way, it's naive IFR. It's recorded deaths in the early days. There was a Sero survey in it. It came out as about 0.14 or something like that. And that was not assuming any undercounting at all. So based on that kind of data and the assumption that rural India isn't somehow naturally protected from having a high death toll, I would say you had at least 3 times undercounting. But if you look at some of the higher estimates of possible levels of spread, it could go up to 5, 6, 7, or even 8 times undercounting. So I gave a range in that piece that I believe that the scale of undercounting is somewhere between true deaths at 3 times recorded deaths up to 8 times recorded deaths. That was for 2020. I don't really know how that would have changed in 2021, but that was for 2020.
So could you compare this with the estimate in the New York Times, where I think you're also credited, where they have the worst case scenario is way worse than 8.
Yes. So I mean, so they spoke to a number of different people. I gave them what, I kind of pointed them towards my own estimates, and I explained the basis of those in terms of what I believe is a credible range of IFR and what I believe is a credible range of spread. I presume that they also talked to people who believe that IFR could be higher because their higher end of IFR goes up to 0.6. I think that's unlikely. I think that's a very kind of pessimistic level given India's age structure. But then, of course, I'm also looking at these rural reports where a fair number of villages are seeing 0.5% of the population dying in a kind of outbreak. And I'm saying, well, okay, during this wave, I don't really know what IFR is. It could be really high. So yes, I think their upper estimates are pessimistic, but I wouldn't rush to dismiss them either. I wouldn't rush to say that they're impossible. They're higher than my upper estimates, let's say.
Sorry, but there are 2 things here, right? Which is, one is you could say that you look at the rate of undercounting in Mumbai, and then you extrapolate that to the whole country.
I don't think that would be right. So I don't think that would be right, because I think that you're bound to have much better fatality counting in Mumbai than you're going to have in even in rural Maharashtra, let's say, even if within the same state, it's going to be much better. Yeah.
So then you say you estimate the IFR for Mumbai, but then you want to use that for the country. Then you have to estimate infection rates using Sero surveys for the whole country.
Correct. Yes. Correct.
Isn't that a very significant problem? I mean, for instance, just one problem would be that there's probably a pretty high non-response rate in these Sero surveys, right? I don't know how they're conducted, but you go ask someone for a sample, they probably say no. And there might be a systematic bias there, which is the people who are more infected might be more likely to, or maybe less likely. I don't know. There might be a bias in terms of who responds to your surveys. And unless you're really careful in re-stratifying the data and getting rid of these effects, you might get something that might be off by significant factors. So, I mean, how does one trust the national level sero surveys? I know ICMR has done stuff, but how does one trust them in any?
No, I agree. I think it is hard to trust the national, I mean, to be completely confident in that data, in that national level sero survey data. You see, I think that broadly, those in their second and third sero surveys, ICMR were doing roughly the right thing. I mean, they were trying to probably match. There's only a published paper that I've read about the second. There's probably a paper about the third, but I haven't read the paper. I've only read the preliminary data as it was reported first. But as far as I can tell from the paper on the second sero survey, they were correctly trying to match, to kind of do demographic correction so that they would get a national estimate. But of course, it's still a very small sample of 30,000 odd people in a country of 1.4 billion. So of course, you could have really you still have big uncertainties on the figures that they came out with in the second and third sero surveys. Their broad figures were kind of consistent with a lot of smaller sero surveys, which were more credible. So, their figures for what you're seeing in urban areas, urban non-slum areas, urban slum areas, rural areas, seem to be consistent with what I found in a lot of state level sero surveys, which had a much better kind of coverage given the population. So in that sense, I think that they're broadly credible, but of course, how much trust to put in the actual numbers is an open question. But you do need that to use IFR calculations. You're right.
I see. And sorry, let me see if somebody else has a question. I have a follow-up.
By the way, I can't see chat. So if you're putting the question in the chat, it flashes up briefly, but it doesn't. I haven't got it open at the moment. So if there are any questions in chat, please, and including the one that I said I would respond to, which I've now forgotten.
Maybe, let me read that one out. That one was, how much was the reinfection fraction that was considered for Mumbai, and what are the estimated numbers due to reinfection? That is the question that is in the chat by Suman Datta. Suman, you're welcome to unmute yourself and ask if you have a follow-up.
So to answer that question, or to try and answer that question, it's very difficult to know. You saw a very large slum surge even during this wave, in terms of, as far as you could tell from cases and making some assumptions about detection of infections in the slums based on previous data, past data. There was a large slum surge in this wave. You had very high prevalence in the slums already by the time this wave started. So my guess would be that in the slums, there was a significant number of reinfections. Perhaps of the total infections, maybe 20, 30%, maybe even more were reinfections. But I'm being really hand-wavy there because doing the kind of analysis to come to a credible estimate is really hard. And I feel that the city corporation has the data of some kind and will eventually share it, is what I'm hoping. And then we'll be able to say with more confidence what fraction of those infections in the second wave were reinfections. But based on just looking at the scale of the first and second slum surges, I would say that in the slums, it must have been really quite significant. This would also be consistent with a number of journalistic reports which have said that you didn't have a lot of hospitalizations coming from the slums. So you had cases coming from the slums, but you didn't have hospitalizations. And the possible explanation for that would be that these were milder cases in general. And one reason why they might have been milder cases was because some of them were reinfections in general. But there's a lot of speculation in there. So I would find it hard to put a citywide figure on it.
There's one more question in the chat by someone who says his mic is not working. Let me just read it out. Yeah, since the antibodies don't last long compared to the time scale of collective waves, there might be numbers that are missing in the seroprevalence data. And how does one account for this in the models?
So first, I wouldn't say that the antibodies don't last long, because it seems to be very dependent on which antibody tests you use. So some tests are very much more sensitive to old infections than others, as one of the things that I've learned by reading a lot of serosurvey studies. And so some of the tests seem to be quite good at picking up old infections, which means that perhaps we shouldn't think of it as the antibodies are fading, but maybe we should think of it as the sensitivity of the test diminishes to prior infection over time. Now, when you have that problem where you are using tests which become increasingly insensitive, so you miss a higher and higher fraction of old infections, it is hard to deal with. I've tried to deal with it in a couple of kind of studies, mini studies, including one on Delhi, where I tried to take whatever Delhi data was available and say, okay, so there are people who have specifically written down models to try to deal with this question of waning sensitivity of tests. So you can try to use those models. You can couple that with some Monte Carlo simulation. And so, for example, in Delhi, based on those serosurveys and other available data, including fatality data, I concluded that by the end of the year, there was about 50% prior infection in the city. So median estimate of around 50%, maybe a little bit over 50%. And then another survey was done in Delhi in 2021, in the early part of this year, which seemed to bear that out. It kind of found 56%, and it used a different test. It used a test which it was only reported briefly, so I don't know the technical details, but they reported that it used a test which was specifically less sensitive, lost sensitivity less quickly over time to prior infection. So you can try to remedy this situation where you have it occurring. It occurred in Mumbai as well, so it's occurred in probably many places, but it complicates matters. I think the best thing to do would be to try to, now that we have enough knowledge for this, try to use tests which don't have this problem to the same degree.
Any other questions?
I have one more question, but I can wait if there are other questions. Okay, let me ask. At some point, we will presumably not have to guess, right? Because we will have national all-cause mortality data. Maybe later in the year. Is that right? Or?
I mean, we'll have national all-cause mortality data, but of course, bearing in mind that death registration is not complete in India. Right, so bearing in mind that death registration is, I don't know, around 84% or something like that nationally, and it's very variable. So some states it's effectively complete, some states it's not. Some states it's very far from complete. Also bearing in mind that especially where you don't have complete death registration, you may have had falls during this period. So you may have had more kind of informal funerals where a death never gets registered. It may still be hard to interpret, but nevertheless, whatever becomes available will still be valuable. So it won't produce a kind of complete answer to these questions, a complete picture, but it'll still be a valuable kind of addition. I think another thing that will be valuable is survey data. So rather than the actual all-cause mortality data from the civil registration system, it will be data from the sample registration system or other surveys, which include questions about mortality. And that kind of data may give us a really kind of valuable snapshot of what happened with mortality during the pandemic.
Okay, thank you.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
So when you're comparing deaths due to COVID with deaths due to other causes, there is also the issue that during the lockdown and
Rajul, could you speak up a little, please, because you're very faint.
Okay. Is this better?
A little bit, okay. Yeah, let's go. Yeah.
Is it better now?
Yeah, now it's better.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so there are all these other causes of mortality, for example, tuberculosis and other diseases and so on. Many of these things which require regular medical care in order to prevent mortality.
Yeah.
And those mechanisms have suffered during the lockdowns and then during the pandemic and so on. Is there any credible way of separating these things out? Is there any hope for that? Because as far as I understand, especially in rural India, deaths get registered by and large only when there is a legal requirement, there's some property or something. That is when people feel the need to register a death. Otherwise, the death doesn't even get registered, much less registered with a medical cause, and so on. So all these complications. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't feel very expert to answer that question, but I think that, the kind of process of what's called verbal autopsying might be able to shed light on that. So when you do have, if you do ever have mortality surveying, it'd be good if it went alongside verbal autopsying, which is basically, I think, where you ask people, the family members, about the circumstances of the death, about pre-existing, prior conditions which the person may have had. And you, in that way, try to understand whether this was a COVID death or not, regardless of whether there was a COVID test or not. But I don't know how accurately that will be able to map out a rise in other causes of other kinds of mortality. For example, people unable to access medical care because of overwhelmed systems, because of lockdown and so forth. Obviously, it's an important question. I don't know how much we will ever know, in a sense, beyond maybe some headline figures of what mortality was as a whole, in terms of unpacking what the causes of that were.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome.
Okay. Unless if there are any more questions. Okay. If not, let's thank Murad again for the wonderful talk.
Thank you.
Yeah, and hope everyone stays safe.